what happens next. All right, let's go. Mission Presidios and Slaves. All right. In recent years, historians have painted a fascinating picture of indigenous power in North America. They have shown that many indigenous societies retain a great deal of control over their native grounds, and at times acted as, quote, militaristic slaving societies. Even full-scale empires, so this is the Europeans, even full-scale empires, but with no much emphasis on native control, it is easy to miss the point the Europeans also adapted to the new circumstances, when, just as the Comanches and the Utes expanded their prospective ranges in the 18th century, the Spaniards bolstered their religious, military, and demographic presence in northern Mexico. A fantastic silver boom below allowed them to dig in their heels. Mexico production of silver bullion increased by an astounding 400% from 1,272,680 kilograms. That's 1,403 tons of fine silver in 1707, 1701, and 1710 to 4,878,510 or 5,378 tons in 1801 and 1810, making Mexico the world's leading producer of the white metal. For much of that century, Mexico mining more than half of all the silver extracted in the world. To keep the supply flowing, the crown invested some of the proceeds in military garrisons. In effect, Spain militarized Mexico's northern frontier. The mission was Spain's first frontier institution. In the earlier years of colonization, farers boldly ventured into unsettled areas, establishing contact with indigenous peoples and acting as diplomats, spies, and agents of the crown. In a field-defining essay published almost 100 years ago, Berkeley historian Robert Hubert E. Bolton argued that just as English backwoods settlers had, quote, driven back the indigenous step by step, the French fur traders had brought the Eswart tribes into friendly relations with the French government, end quote. The mission had played the leading role on the Spaniards' frontier government. The mission had played the leading role in the Spanish frontier, teaching millions of indigenous people the language of Cervantes, introducing them to the mysteries of Christianity, exposing them to every conceivable European plant and animal, giving them a rudiment of European crafts and agriculture. Yet all of these accomplishments, now we know that Bolton approaches was directly Eurocentric. I'm sorry, author, but so are you. Mission proved inadequate to secure an unsettled frontier. Working alone or in pairs, farers simply lacked the meaning a European-style regime. Missionaries depended on native leaders to decide whether it was to their people's advantage to live within a mission, and that life under the mission bell was too regimented for them to ultimately abandon their missions, as the farriers were powerless to retrieve absconding indigenous peoples. They had to rely on Spanish soldiers to help them carry out their work of religious instruction. And if the mission's vulnerabilities were noticeable, even in the case in which indigenous people were initially cooperative, they were blatantly obvious when missionaries were dealing with powerful groups such as the Utes, Comanches, and Apaches, who refused to allow missions into their territories. These nations wanted nothing to do with the meddlesome, robed men bent on monogamous marriages and sedentary way of life and other structures, and there was nothing the missionaries could do about it. Spanish officials thus opt for more forceful means of protecting Mexico's Silver District. They ordered the establishment of military garrisons all along the frontier to deploy more soldiers. There certainly had been militias and presidios before, but the shift in emphasis was clear. Although missionaries continued their work throughout the 18th century and even expanded into new areas such as Alta California, the military came to play a more prominent role. In 1709, northern New Mexico had 15 companies of a total of 562 soldiers. By 1764, the number of units had more than doubled to 23 companies and 13 squads. And the total troops strengthened was 1,271. To keep southward moving indigenous peoples such as the Apaches and the Comanches in check, Spanish policymakers also decided to set up line of presidios stretching from the Atlantic to the Pacific. This presidial line was very close to today's international border between Mexico and the United States. Of course, the current border took shape only in the middle of the 19th century in the aftermath of the U.S.-Mexican War. But considered that the border is merely the outrim of an area over which the nation exercises control, this line of presidios overlaid on indigenous domains constituted Mexico's northmost edge of effective control. Therefore, its border in a more profound way. For indigenous people, the presence of missions and presidios represented both opportunities and danger. Indigenous people preferred to engage with outposts intermittently and on their own terms, perhaps to procure goods and foods, or even to gain temporary employment, but nothing more. However, their very existence made life risky for natives living in the vicinity, as they increased the indigenous vulnerability to European labor demands. This was especially true for small nomadic and semi-nomadic bands that had little else to offer but their labor. The alternatives were stark for them. They could either take an inaccessible area beyond the pale of Spanish control, or strike a bargain with the devil, so to speak, by joining a mission or presidio while negotiating the best possible arrangement. Consider the choices available for Sera indigenous peoples. The Seras had been living on the coast, the Sonora, with little outside interference for centuries, if not millennia. Their language is unrelated to any other in the region, and isolated in a parlance of linguists. Seri monochondral DNA exhibited a distribution of markers that is extremely rare among the indigenous people of Mexico or the Southwest, with a high percentage of a haplogroup C finding lineage, and their Y chromosome DNA reveals low level of diversity, also suggesting isolation. To be sure, the Seras traded with their neighbors, as an archaeological and historical record make clear, but they could always retreat into their homeland, which was so inhospitable that no other group wanted to have it. Anyone who has seen this coastal desert would readily appreciate the tremendous difficulty of eking out a living there. Agriculture was entirely out of the question. The Seras, or the Comaca, as they called themselves, were true nomads, extremely attuned to a variety of local resources. They regularly used as many as 75 different plants and had names for an astounding 350 to 400 of them, as ethnobotanists have been able to determine. The Seras Seris, also turned to the bounty of the sea. On flimsy boats made from reeds, they ventured into the Sea of Cortez to hunt turtles, even during the winter months when the animals laid half buried on the seafloor, and to gather eelgrass when the shoots from the submerged plant broke off and floated to the surface in April. The Seris dread the seeds, ground them, and made a gruel, which they ate with turtle fat or honey. This is the only instance of a human population relying on a marine seed plant as a major food source. Only towards the end of the 17th centuries did the Jesuits begin missionizing the Seris. Father Adam Gilge, a native from what is now the Czech Republic, was one of them. In 1688, his journey to Sonora to take up his post at the mission of Santa Maria del Popolo. The site was nothing but a crude shrine of few Seri families living in branch huts and scattered field irrigated by the San Miguel River. The name Santa Maria del Popolo one shared with the opulent church in Rome, as certainly incongruous, but the most disappointing circumstances from a committed priest like Father Gilg Gilg was that the mission laid well outside of Sierra homeland, because the coast would have been too harsh an environment to sustain a community based on agriculture. Popula was 75 miles inland, merely a beachhead on the edge of the Seri world. Still, Father Gilg took these drawbacks in stride. This German-speaking Jesuit quickly discovered that the Seri language would be a major obstacle to his evangelizing efforts. Efforts, yet he claimed that their speech reminded him of German. Gilg was taken back by the Seri's nakedness, but he found the comfort in the fact that their lack of clothes did not seem to cause lewdness or promiscuity. "I have not seen a single unmarried woman sin," end quote, he wrote. He even found a Seris halting attempts to wear clothes amusing. Quote, "Some wear only shirts, others wear only pants, yet others wear their pants wrapped around the chest, and all of these articles pass from the hand to hand, because the Serids engage in a betting game and play each other with clothes," end quote. Father Gilg was generally content with his flock calling them "my Series," end quote, when he wrote to his brethren in Europe, quote, "This is not the kind of mission where one runs the risk of becoming martyrized," he proclaimed assuredly, but not everyone can come here, as the work requires missionaries who are able to withstand discomfort and want of everything. Father Gilg hopeful letters fit with our image of missions as privileged sites of indigenous European interaction. Like many other idealization, this one is based on a monicum of truth. The series did receive the Jesuit missionaries peacefully, but one important reason was that the padres gave away food liberty. As one missionary noted, it was necessary to win the Seris by their mouths, quote unquote. By all accounts, the robed men delivered. The river valley of central Sonora were narrow, but possessed surprisingly fertile land. By building canals, dams, and wells, using manure and fertilizer, applying European plowing methods, and rotating crops, missionaries were able to get sizable surpluses. Just below the surface, however, coerced was also a part of a bargain between the missionaries and indigenous peoples. The mission of Santa Maria del Populo, for example, had originated as a refuge community in the wake of a series of slave raids in 1662. A posse of Spaniards had cut a swath through the Seri lands, killing most of the adults of one band and distributing the children in the Spanish town of Sonora. As Father Gilk himself told the story, quote, "Those who survived following the advice of my predecessors, Father Juan Fernandez, deciding to congregate themselves in this place of which I am currently its missionary," end quote. Building this initial nucleus, Father Gilk was able to persuade more Seris to shed their nomadic ways and acquiesce to life under the mission bell. A string of new missions arose, including San Taddeo, San Estequan, and San Maria Magdalena de los Tapucas. It is impossible that many of the nomads were lured solely by Father Gilk's extortions. In German laced with a few Series words, one would imagine, and by his provisions of corn and beef. But at least some of them made their choice under duress. For example, in 1700, Father Gilk accompanied Sergeant Ron Bautista de Escalante and 15 soldiers on a military incursion into the land of the Series. One of their objects was to bring back 10 Series families that had absconded to Papua, taking some cattle in the process. The soldiers caught up with the fleeing indigenous people, flogging them and restoring them to the mission. For the next 6 months, Sergeant Escalante and his soldiers crisscrossed the Seri homeland, watching more than 200 additional indigenous people and dispatching them to the missions. The Seris themselves were divided over the question of whether to seek accommodations in the mission or some other Spanish community or to flee to the inaccessible spot. According to anthropologists and historians Thomas E. Sheridan, out of the total population of around 3,000 in the earlier 18th century, perhaps 10 to 20% chose to settle down. The majority pursued the opposite strategy, avoiding contact with Europeans and retreating deep into their environment refuge. Tiburon, the largest island in Mexico, lies out only about a mile and a half from the continent and is clearly visible for much of the central coast of Sonora. But to get to this island, one has to cross the treacherous Strait of Infernelero. The Spaniards needed good boats to negotiate the strait, strong currents. But the desert coast of Sonora had no trees and therefore no boats no wood for boats. The closest source of wood would have been the Serra del Bacucha or Cerro Preto. But hauled logs for even a medium-sized vessel would have been an unformidable task. The Seris were well aware of the Spaniards' difficulties to getting to Tiburon and to the even more remote island of San Esteban, and thus headed there to escape their control. Negotiating between these two worlds, many Seris chose to straddle them. They would stay in the missions for some time, performing the arduous works of the agriculturalist and stockman, but also frequently flee. Sometimes they would plunder the neighboring missions or nearby ranch, then abscond to the island. Seri bands also would raid one another's settlements, huts, mission cattle as if they were deer, and plunder corn as if they were a wild plant. Ancient animosities, multi-generational vendettas and rivalries, exacerbated by the emergence of agriculture/ranch oasis in the middle of the desert, motivated some of these attacks. They also discovered that they could extend their traditional hunting and gathering activities with the resources recently introduced by the Europeans. The Seri example outscores the weakness of the missionary frontier. After decades of painstaking missionizing, the Jesuit of central Sonora had persuaded only a small share of the Seri nation to settle down and were powerless to prevent them from raiding missions or fleeing from them. The protectionist, I'm gonna look up this word, everybody. Brirazvak. Pertinacious patterns of occasional raids and frequent flight become the norm. The Padres may have thought that they were civilizing the Seris, but the opposite was equally plausible. Shut the fuck up. The Seris had incorporated the missions into their way of life as they continued to move, hunt, and gather. The ineffectiveness of the missions eventually prompted Spanish planners to attempt at a more forceful approach. As the 18th century unfolded, military garrisons and soldiers superseded the mission as a linchpins of Spain's efforts to stabilize the frontier. With the new approach came new forms of coercion. The word presidio captures the dual purpose of garrison and prisons. Since Roman times, presidios have been both military establishments deployed in unsettled areas and cite their criminals served out their prison sentence. Today, the Spanish word presidiario means inmate or prisoner, rather than garrisoned soldiers. Presidial soldiers were professionals who drew a salary from the crown, but they were underpaid. Thus, garrison commanders and soldiers supplemented their earnings by catching indigenous people and selling them to the Spanish colonialists, or by turning presidios into supply centers based on coerced labor. These activities were some common, and brigaders General Pedro del Rivera issued a set of military regulations in 1729. Having toured and inspected most of the presidios of northern Mexico, an 8,000-mile odyssey through Sonora, Chihuahua, New Mexico, Texas, and Louisiana, he had plenty of first-hand experience. The first article of the new regulation forbade governors and presidials commanders, quote, to capture indigenous people of any sex or age in the expedition of war, and to claim said prisoners for themselves or divide them under any motive or pretext, end quote. The practice was quite common, and in fact, these regulations did little to change it. Another grand military inspection conducted by Marquez del Rubia, almost 40 years later, found the soldiers still frequently captured indigenous people. Thus, Ruba put it, quote, it is an occasion to abuse against all of their humanity and rights as a people if they are turned over to the citizens who treat them as slaves, even to the point of selling them, end quote. The Seri nation was among the first to experience this searing transition from missionaries to procedural frontiers. In 1742, the Spanish government established a presidio just to the east of the Seri homeland named San Pedro de la Conquista del Petec. The 50 soldiers deployed in Petec were supposed to bring security to the region, but they had other priorities in mind. A surprise inspection of the garrison conducted only 6 years after its founding gave an unusual glimpse into its operations. A Mexico City lawyer appeared unannounced on a Sunday morning on the summer of 1748 and the Lacendio Rafael Rodriguez Gallardo was an impervious man who enjoyed the full backing of the viceroy. He took possession of the dilapidated officers inside the Presidio, ordering the soldiers to muster and warned the Presidio commander to, quote, stay within his sight at all times. Rodriguez Garrandio then proceeded to the most nettlesome part of his assignment, interviewing the indigenous people held in the garrison and examining the files and detailing their crimes, the length of their imprisonment, and the types of work to which they were assigned. One by one, the indigenous people appeared before a committee of 3 men: Rodriguez Garrandio, and the indigenous translator, and the Apoderado attorney of the Presidio, who had in his possession a few documents regarding the inmate's existence. A native from a Palmyra alt named Nicholas was one of the first to be examined. He appeared, quote, with chains on his legs and said that he had been imprisoned by orders of the indigenous governor of the town of Caborca on the account of an illicit friendship. When Rodriguez Garrandio asked to see Nicholas' file, the Abdurandio responded that there was not one. The indigenous people continued to file into the office. Juan Reyes and Pima from the town of Buena Vista had been in prison for a year for beating up and unaliving his wife. Ignacio Mendenzabal and Mayo from Navajo had been in prison for theft. August Tatabuntama had been in the Presidio for 6 years because he had been a principal leader in the revolt against the Spaniards, and so on. The Apoderado did not have files for the vast majority of the inmates. Of the 88 indigenous peoples who were at the Presidio of Pentec at the time of the inspection, only 5 have been granted proper criminal proceedings. Tellingly, several inmates had been accused of being hechireros or sorcerers, and had been sent to the Presidio by express orders of the missionaries. Rodriguez Galadrios inquest uncovered a microscopes of coercion and enslavement. No matter how serious or light their crimes have been, the natives once inside the Presidio were compelled to work from dawn to dusk. 22 indigenous laborers in shackles, while the remaining 66 were not wearing chains but were constantly monitored. Since many of the prisoners were married, their wives and children also lived at the garrison. They made tortillas, ground panela, of coarse flour made of corn and seed, and fetched water to return for food and clothes. Discipline was extreme. Minor infractions such as being late for work could result into 40 to 50 lashings. Some guards were sadists, beating indigenous people to unconsciousness, burning their armpits with hot wax, and hanging them from their feet with their heads dangling over a fire. 3 indigenous people accused of being harchecheros, I think, at the pueblo of on Avessa died after suffering horrifying head burns as Presidio soldiers attempted to extract their confession. Even, quote, free indigenous at Patik were compelled to work. A native man named Mato Asimia declared that for 6 years he had been sent to work in a nearby mine. The Apaduranrado immediately noted that Mateo was a free indigenous person who had been paid for his work. But Mateo countered that instead of wages, he had received a work certificate from the mine and later had been forced to give it up, to give up the certificate on the grounds that he was a prisoner of the Presidio rather than a free worker. Similarly, Sandoval Baraka declared that for years he had worked in the Presidio as a carpenter. The Abdurradio affirmed that Salvador was not a prisoner, but a servanti labri, free servant. To which the indigenous people replied that, quote, up to now they do not allow me to leave even though I wish to go back to my pueblo, end quote. Salvador received a nominal wage in food and clothes, but he was compelled to stay and work at the Presidio. That the difference between freedom and slavery at the Patik was deceiving. The work performed by the inmates should have been for the public good, beginning with building the Presidio itself. Yet the garrison remained half finished after 6 years. The jail was dangerous. The jail for dangerous criminals consisted of nothing but a grassy area. In fact, the Presidio commanders had used the inmate labor for private gains. Patik, what had been established right next to the large hacienda that belonged to the governor of Sonora or Sinaloa, Austin de Valdesilo. Since the beginning, most of the inmates had been sent to work on his property, building a dam, digging the irrigation ditch, installing fence, and tending the cornfields and wheat fields. Other prisoners had been hard at work, carding, spinning, making cloth on looms, and fermenting minuscule from the Avgave plant. Yet others had toiled in nearby mines. Clearly, the Presidio and San Pedro de la Conquista del Patik had become something of a labor center that serviced the governor's hacienda, made products for sale, and funneled uncorhist workers to various enterprises in the area. Rodriguez Galadro, I can't say it, was so repulsed by what he saw that he ordered the immediate closure of the Presidios and its relocation to a more advantageous place. It turned out the site selected for the new Presidio was in the heart of the Sierra Mission area on the San Miguel River, roughly midway between the mission of the Papulo and Los Angeles. The Presidio between the mission of the Papulo and Los Angeles. The Presidio relocation proved catastrophic for these communities. Within a year, the soldiers of the new Presidio of San Miguel del Horcasatas had taken possession of the best land in the floodplains. In the dry season, the San Miguel River diminished to a trickle at a time when the fields need to be irrigated the most. The soldiers' supply displaced indigenous farmers who had direct access to the river. The Presidio's commanders also appropriated the indigenous labor. They seized about 70 serrera from Pupulo, and put them to work digging the foundations for a new garrison and making adobe bricks for it. Even the Seri women were made to carry mud, grass, a type of thick straw, and other building materials. Quote, they were whipped, beaten, and forced to work as though they were evildoers, end quote, observed Father Thomas Morandia. The series of the mission of Los Angeles fared no better. Soldiers transported about 50 families all along the frontier. Presidios displaced native people from well-irrigated lands, appropriated their labor, and erected buildings, and seized recalcitrant indigenous people and returned them into servants, wives, and concubines, occasionally even selling them as slaves. The final twist of the Seri story shows a tremendous impact of militarization, initially abused by the Spanish soldiers. The Seris retaliated in 1748 to 1749, when a party consisting of both missions and non-mission Seris boldly ran off the entire horse herd of the Presidio of San Miguel del Horcastas, thus reducing the soldiers' mobility, and struck half a dozen mining and smelting centers in the area. They unleashed their most serious attack on a mining town called Aguje, where they killed 43 residents, burned the houses after looting them, and desecrating the church. Thank God. Good job. I think that's based. I don't care. According to one priest, they, quote, poured out the holy oils and with infernal fury lanced the painting of our great mother and Lady of Guadalupe 9 times, and took the holy vestments, which they burned after having eaten them off. Good job, indigenous people. Fuck those colonizers. The indigenous rebels even faced off with the soldiers' dispatch and apprehended them, and succeeded in seizing their muskets. The Spanish authorities became incensed. In April 1750, they held an emergency meeting with colonialists and ecclesiastics, and formally declared the Seri nation treacherous, arrogant, incendiary, and apostate, end quote, and complemented a policy of wholesale removal. The principal proponent of the extirpation was, as this policy became known, was none other than Rodriguez Gallardo and La Ciendio, who had been so thorough in his interrogations at Picnic. He made it clear now that what he had in mind was not merely sending away a few ringleaders, as had been done in the past. Quote, in times of Governor Manuel Banal de Haudobero in 1736 for Cabasilia from New York, were driven in shackles by a detachment of 5 soldiers. Rodriguez Gallardo contended, and quote, and 3 of these criminals were able to escape while killing Corporal Lucas de Espinosa. Rodriguez Gallardo himself had dispatched a chain gang of the most famous Apaches and Seri robbers, arsonists, and killers, end quote, with even more disastrous results. Having reached the town of Seninola after a journey of 200 leagues, more than 600 miles, 9 prisoners got away and within days killed all the residents of the nearby ranch. The worst aspect of these piecemeal policies of punishment from the Spaniards respective was that even the Seri captives who had been marched all the way to central Mexico had eventually returned. Their sense of place and direction seems almost patronatural. quote, take a Seri indigenous person into the depths blindfolded, be it mines, dungeons, or truncated labyrinths, and turn him around 1,000 times, and he will still be able to tell towards what wind or direction he is facing, as if he were a living compass. Captives who made their way back to Sonara often became Cabecilas, Cabeciallas, who used their newfound geographics and social knowledge to extract revenge. Quote, two Seres dispatched to a textile factories of Quantaro by Governor, Hadobro, came back to these coasts, and only these two have put themselves at the head of the group of fugitives, causing turmoil at least 20 homicides. Rodriguez Gallardo's solution was to deport all Seri indigenous peoples to a place from which they would never return. It was not the first time Spanish policymakers had removed indigenous people in significant numbers, at least since the early 1700s. Spanish soldiers had driven long lines of Taboso and Apache tied together in Coloras from Nuevo Leon and Chihuahua to central and southern Mexico and the Caribbean islands. The military buildup on the frontier now allowed Spanish officials to envision even more ambitious schemes. By mid-century, Rodriguez believed that it was possible to remove an entire Seri nation of around 3,000 people. All male and female Seris over the age of 8 would be sent away, preferably by sea, because once secure on a boat, they will only be sent away. They'll only be able to seek their freedom if their own shipwreck and ruin, and without seeing the lay of our continent, they would not understand how to return, end quote. Given that textile sweatshops of central Mexico had not been able to keep the Seris from returning home, Spanish officials decided to ship the indigenous prisoners to the ultramarine islands, a vague formulation of that probably meant the Caribbean islands and quite possibly the Philippines, where many Mexican vagrants and convicts were already being sent. The only Seres who would not be shipped away, children younger than 8, would be marched to the Apache frontier to be used as reinforcements. Spanish colonialists and their Apata allies had been clinging precariously to their communities in the face of the Apache raids in places such as the valley of Bacanachi or Terranate or San Francisco, Xavier del Cachuta, along the headwaters of the San Pedro River. The Seri children would add to their numbers. The governor of Sonora predicted that quote, the Spaniards people of reason among whom they intended to place the Seri children will not only agree to it, but wish for the children to help them contain their enemy, Apaches. In this case, indigenous slavery was intended as a demographic strategy to populate a dangerous frontier. The plan of extirpation unfolded swiftly. In April 1750, Sonoran government Diego Ortiz Pereira announced plans to launch the expedition to the island of Tiburon. Over the summer, he gathered men and provisions and had 7 large boats outfitted for the Yaqui River to get across the Strait of Infernalio. When the late summer rains finally arrived, Spanish soldiers began sweeping the coastal area and arresting series and pueblos of Cacupu or Apodapi and Populo. In September, the Spanish soldiers of Pima auxiliaries began crossing over to the Tiburon. They faced a determined opponent. At the sight of the approaching boats, the series dispersed, poisoning and befouling water holes with herbs and rotting carcasses. In the heat of the summer, they leveraged their superior survival skills while forcing the parched intruders to drink from maggot-infested water sources or import casks of a precarious liquid from the mainland. Hell yeah, get 'em. Go indigenous people. In spite of the tremendous difficulties, the Spanish Puma force prevailed. God damn it. But adult series were laid away in ropes and chains. Not quite to the Caribbean islands as originally proposed by but to Guatemala. Even then, some of the men returned. But the women did not come back. An unspecified number of Seri children were also sent to the Apache frontier as planned. The mission records at Temecula in southern Arizona reveal that some Seris were baptized in 1750s. The extirpation strategy ultimately failed, however. Many Seris remained in their homeland and had even more reason to rebel. 3 years later, the expedition up to Tiburon, a Seri leader named Chapello, had a frank conversation with missionaries. When the Spanish urged the indigenous leader to surrender, Chapello replied, quote, "I know that if we continue fighting, we are damning ourselves, but there is no other way. We are accustomed to living with women. We do not know where our wives are, whether they are living or dead. We would not marry us. You would not marry us to others, and if we take others, you will order us whipped." Chapello's reasoning was unassailable. A series mission program, which had lasted for more than 70 years, had given way to extirpations and enslavement. Cholera epidemics. In the course of the 18th, Maria, oh my God, I gotta do this. I had 4 minutes to do that. Yep. In the course of the 18th century, presidios transformed the human landscape of northern Mexico, giving rise to sizable towns, functioning as reservations and generally giving Spanish officials, the military planners, the ability to launch remarkably bold social engineering projects. The Apaches were notable victims. They drifted southward into the silver-bearing areas of northern Mexico, at first sporadically, and then with greater frequency in the 1740s and 1750s. Decades of suspicion and mistrust finally burst into open conflict. To prevent the disruption, and to keep the silver flowing, Spanish officials subjugated the Apache to some of the same policies tested earlier on the Ceres. According to the estimates of historian Paul Conrad, between 1770 and 1860, some 3,000 to 5,000 Apaches and other indigenous from the north were led away in chains, bound for central or southern Mexico. The most dangerous were shipped to Cuba. The sight of these lines of indigenous peoples tied to one another became all too familiar to their contemporaries. At the start of this cycle of deportation, Viceroy Carlos Francisco del Croix felt the need to write a letter of advice to one of his officers on how to conduct these marches. Croix who was nearly at the end of his tour of duty in the New World, had commanded the Spanish garrison to Kuta in northern Africa earlier in his career, and therefore knew a thing or two about transporting prisoners. He was very concerned about the potential escapes, as his advice makes clear. Quote, "Start the march under the cloak of night. Keep the indigenous men in shackles and the women and children tied with ropes. Never reveal the route with the cholera. Never reveal the route that the cholera will follow to minimize the likelihood of an ambush." Is that cholera? Cholera. Hold on, I'm gonna check something real quick. Let me check something real quick. I'm right, it's cholera, just spelled differently. He recommended that when the caravan set up camps in the middle of the wilderness, far from any settlements, 2/3 of the soldiers form a circle around the prisoners, and the last 3 remained as lookouts. Crookes also dispensed some words of wisdom about how to treat the prisoners. Quote, "Allow them to have a hot meal at least once a day. Do not let the provision of water run out, and do not walk during the hottest hours of the day when the sun is at its most intense, but instead have them wash the clothes assigned to them at this time." End quote. In spite of Crookes' insistence on moderation, these marches were generally dreadful. Soldiers had the incentive to give the prisoners as little food as possible in order to profit from the budget set aside for food. They also forced the indigenous people to walk for hours on end in order to wear them down and prevent any escape attempts. Terrible abuses arose from the fact that the majority of the prisoners were women and children, at the mercy of male soldiers. On at least one occasion, some prisoners were able to escape when the Spanish soldiers driven the cholera took 4 female prisoners inside a room, while leaving only 1 guard outside. Quite apart from the catalog of indignities, the abuse during these marches is insidious and contagious disease. Slavery and epidemics had gone hand in hand since contact. The abundant documentation of the late 18th century bears this linkage out. In effect, these drives moved people living in regions of low demographic density to major urban agglomeration. Let me make sure. I don't know what this word is. Agglomeration, such as Mexico City and Veracruz, which were rife with disease, considering Sergeant Jose Antonio March of 1797. He started in the middle of November from the garrison of Pelara del Conchos, north of Parral, with 71 Apaches, 13 adults males, 57 women, and 1 girl of about 12. Sergeant Uribe was somewhat apprehensive because among the 13 males there was one individual named Polito, who had already escaped from an earlier cholera, and another one called Garland, quote, who enjoyed a reputation among his people for his spirit and past deeds of war. As it turns out, there was no escape attempts. In a little over a month, all but one of the prisoners had reached Mexico City safely. A long woman had been left at the Presidio of San Miguel del Corral Gordo, now Villa Hidalgo, about 60 miles south of Parral, to receive medical treatment. Other than this medical issue, the drive had been uneventful. The cholera reached Mexico City right around Christmas time. The plan was to rest for a few days before resuming the march to Veracruz. On December 26, 13 Apache men were escorted into the prison of the Acordiada prison, while the 57 females were interned at the hospice for the poor. Disaster struck during this time. Of the 57 Apache females kept at hospice, 14 developed skin eruptions, characteristics of smallpox. Smallpox was the cause of a virus called Virilia major, which moves from host to host through direct contact. The virus passes from a sick person to a new host through invisible droplets of bodily fluids or secretions, which enter the new host bloodstream via the mouth, nose, or eyes. Alternatively, dried out scabs from a recent sufferer also can transmit the virus. The hospice teeming with women from all over Mexico City, easily the largest city in the Western Hemisphere, would have offered nearly ideal conditions for contagions. A face-to-face encounter with an infected person would have sufficed, as would contact with dried out scabs remaining on the floor, beds, and clothes. The Apache women must have become infected almost immediately on arrival. The incubation period for smallpox is between 10 to 14 days. During this time, only mid-discomfort, which could easily be mistaken for a common cold, is apparent. When the symptoms, high fevers, headaches, and backaches, vomiting, and skin eruptions flare up with frightening rapidity and virulence, hospice authorities reported the onset of the illness among the Apache women around the middle of January, a little over 14 days after their initial internment. And on January 17th, they wrote that 9 of the women had died and 5 remained gravely ill. Over the next few days, the illness continued to spread, even though the hospice administrators made valiant efforts to contain the outbreak by moving 3 of the effective Apaches to the Royal Hospital for Indigenous, where the illness may well have spread even further, and isolating another 2 who were bedridden and unable to move. Other Apaches got sick. By middle of February, the count had reached 32 dead and 4 infected. The disease was ravaged nearly 2/3 of the Apache women kept in the hospice for the poor. They had ended their days with the priest at their bedside offering to baptize them and save their soul for eternal damnation. The Apache men fared even worse. The Acordiada prison, one of the most characteristic buildings of the 18th century New Mexico, was still relatively new, but its narrow hallways, dark and damp cells, and extremely crowded offered ideal conditions for the spread of the disease. Not a single Apache inmate was spared. By early February, of 14 Apache males, 13 recently arrived in the cholera, and 1 more who was already at the Acordia. 5 had died, 7 had become gravely ill, and the remaining 2 appeared to be recovering as if by a miracle. The condition of starvation to which these Apache had been subjected during their march to Mexico City, and possibly during their stay at the Accordia, must have made their suffering even worse. Studies have revealed that a correlation between malnourishment and some of the worst effects to smallpox, especially blindness. For the people like the Apaches who had lived all their lives free of disease, the experience must have been terrifying. After the onset of symptoms, the eruption proliferated, not only on the skin but also along the monocules, the meniscus membrane, in the mouth and throat, making basic functions such as eating, drinking, and talking extremely painful. In the worst cases, the pustules coverage. Death is not long in coming after the appearance of these oozing wounds. Even to the Apache males who survived their bouts with smallpox remained extremely weak for the extended period. When the order came down from the viceroy to resume the march to Veracruz, only 21 women were deemed fit to continue. We do not know the ultimate fate of these women, but after having tangled with smallpox, they faced a second life and death struggle along the Gulf of Mexico coast in the form of two mosquito-borne killers, yellow fever and malaria. Stagnant waters, warm temperatures, and lush tropical environments make the port of Veracruz an ideal habitat for the multitude of insects, including the Aedes, or the transmitting of yellow fever, the Anophilias transmitters of malaria, mosquitoes. Clouds of mosquitoes cover the swamp coastal areas around the port of Veracruz and are impossible to avoid, least of all in the dungeons holding indigenous people like San Juan de Eluy. During the day, one can swat away a few mosquitoes, but at night, whilst asleep, one is completely at the mercy. Hundreds or even thousands of bites are not uncommon. And all it takes is one bite from an infected female mosquito of either species to get into trouble. Of these two illnesses, yellow fever was easily the most lethal to a people lacking immunity, like these indigenous prisoners from the deserts of northern Mexico and what is now American Southwest. The yellow fever virus passes through the mosquito saliva into the bloodstream of a human host and spreads to the liver, where it reproduces, causes chills, muscle pains, and high fevers after 3 to 6 days. The skin of the sufferer becomes noticeably yellow as a result of the damage of the liver, hence the illness name in English. In Spanish, it is often referred to as vomito. They use the N-word for black, or black vomit, because it also causes hemorrhages and gastrointestinal tract, and vomiting blood is often dark red or black. Yellow fever outbreaks could easily cause mortality rates of more than 50% among people who had no prior exposure to Aedes aegypti, can't say it. Although the fragmentary information about the choleras does not permit even a rough estimate of the mortality rates of indigenous prisoners held in Veracruz or shipped to Cuba, and consists in constant concern of Spanish officials about malignant fevers. Are doing good. A clear sign that yellow fever and malaria lurked in the background. The cholerias of the late 18th and early 19th centuries show in tangible ways that the epidemic disease did not spread evenly across the Americas. Indigenous people living in the interior of North America seem to have suffered comparatively less from epidemic diseases than those inhabited coastal regions or residing in large urban agglomerations. In the dry and sparsely populated regions of northern Mexico and the Americas Southwest, pathogens had a harder time spreading than in coastal areas. Their tropical disease reigned supreme in the urban centers, where the crowding diseases, quote unquote, are example. For example, smallpox and cholera were common. There is little doubt that the cholerias of the late 18th centuries were the ideal mechanisms for affecting indigenous people from the north, by forcing them into close and even intimate contact with Spanish soldiers for a month or longer, parading them through towns and cities, compelling them to mingle with the criminals and paupers in jails and hospice in the large cities of central Mexico, and finally marching them to the Gulf Coast, thus exposing them to another set of mosquitoes-borne diseases. And Spaniards made these indigenous people as vulnerable as possible to smallpox, yellow fever, and other deadly diseases. It is also likely that the cholerias facilitated the spread of epidemic diseases from south to north. As soldiers and drivers moved back and forth, the indigenous prisoners already exposed to pathogens in central and southern New Mexico escaped and found their way back to their home communities in the north. This is one of the most elusive and tantalizing aspects of the indigenous drives of the late 18th and early 19th centuries. From 1775 to 1782, North America experienced a smallpox epidemic of continental proportions, from the Atlantic to the Pacific, and from the Caribbean to southern Mexico to Canada, as has been documented by historian Elizabeth E. Finn. The exact origins of this major outbreak is unknown, but sometime in 1779, it reached Mexico City. With its 130,000 inhabitants and its many jails and other nodes of infection. The largest city in the Western Hemisphere offered a most auspicious environment for the spread of smallpox. When the first cases were reported in the late summer of 1779, the illness seemed eerily mild, but it gained strength during the fall. By late December, more than 44,000 Mexico City residents had come down with smallpox. An estimate of 18,000 had succumbed to the disease. Indigenous people from northern Mexico most certainly have been affected. In 1778, no less than 3 different cholerias originating in Tamaulipas, Coahuila, and Chihuahua. The disease radiated from all directions. Finn looked at the burial records of various parishes, tracking the increasing numbers of deaths. As the disease moved like a tribal wave from town to town, although priests seldom indicated the cause of death, the skyrocketing number of burial leaves no doubt as to the reason. Smallpox relentlessly marched north to the east to document. During the winter of 1780, Varelia made dramatic inroads through much of central Mexico. By the late spring and early summer, it had reached the mining areas of Parral and Chihuahua. By the end of the year, it had spread all the way to New Mexico, as well as to the coast of Sinaloa and Sonora, and to portions of, oh my gosh, here we go, the Tamaulipas and Texas. And by the summer of 1781, it had reached the, oh my gosh, here we go, the Comancheria. Of course, it is impossible to correlate specific indigenous tribes with the spread of this the devastating the epidemic. Devastating. But it's remarkable that even in the midst of this outbreak, the choleras continued. One in 1780 and three more in 1781. These indigenous drives moving dozens of susceptible indigenous hosts, and acquiring soldiers to move back and forth between central and northern Mexico would have been excellent carriers of the disease. Where are we at? 20 more minutes? We're on the contracts and expansions, chapter 9. 3 more chapters to go. Let me look ahead real quick. Hold on. Hopefully there's a stopping point. Woo. Nope, not for a while. But I got 20 minutes. Holy crap. Okay, right there. 205. Where are we at? 205. 205. 205. That's a lot. All right, let's try. We're not going to try it. We're not going to make it there, but we're going to keep going. Contractions, and expansions. By the early 19th centuries, indigenous slavery had nearly disappeared on the east coast of North America. In colonial times, the Carolinas had been a major indigenous slaving ground. New Englanders had impressed rebellious indigenous people and shipped them to the Caribbeans. The French colonialists in eastern Canada had impressed thousands of natives from the interior. During the 18th and early 19th centuries, however, the traffic of natives was replaced almost completely by that of African slaves. Only a few vestiges of the old trade networks remain, notably in Florida. Their indigenous traditions and captivity harkened all the way back to pre-Columbia times continued to function, but even these practices became redirected towards black people. The Seminoles, for instance, took Africans, not doing that one because I don't know, not surprisingly, Americans living along the eastern seaboard lost any awareness of earlier forms of indigenous bondage. When they spoke or wrote about slavery in the 19th century, they invariably meant African slavery. Yet indigenous slavery continued to thrive in the West, even expanded as traffickers capitalizing on some of the momentous changes of the early 1800s. Mexico's struggle for independence from Spain, 1810 to 1821, was probably the most important catalyst of the expansions. Ironically, the leaders of the insurgency called the, quote, the abolition of slavery forever, end quote, and the elimination of, quote, all distinctions of caste, so we shall be all equal, end quote. And they made good on their promises. The newly independent government granted citizenship rights to all indigenous peoples living in Mexico and abolished slavery in 1829. However, presaging what would happen later in the centuries in the United States with the Civil War and the Emancipation Proclamation, these measures, far from ending indigenous slavery, paved the way for its transformation to further expansion. More immediately, Mexico's 11-year struggle spelled economic disaster. Much of the fighting took place in the mining districts, prompting workers to abandon the silver mines. With no workers there to pump out the water that accumulated as a result of rainstorms and underground seepage, the mines became completely flooded, and these extraordinary engines of growth became mere holes on the ground. It would take half a century for Mexico's mineral exports to return to late colonial levels. In the meantime, the economic decline led to an outbreak of most frontier control. The number of soldiers posted in the northern Mexico dwelling presidios were abandoned, and the region became vulnerable to indigenous attack. the Comanche, who had been expanding for a century, and the Apaches, who knew the terrain extremely well, pushed deep into Mexico, just sending the haciendas and abandoning mines and capturing women and children. The Comanche in Mexico. The Comanche expansion into Mexico started suddenly and coined with the initial turmoil of independence. For few testimonies are as eloquent as that of landowner and politician Miguel Ramos, who had grown up in the state of Coahuila, just south of Texas, during the halcyon days of the Spanish silver boom. A line of presidio running along the Rio Grande had afforded him home state a measure of security that had made it wealthier than better populated than Texas. Though not impassable, those garrisons presented a real obstacle to indigenous raiding. As Ramos explained, quote, the various tribes of the Comancheria lived in enormous plains of the Sierras between Texas and New Mexico, north of the line of presidios, and they knew very well that the principal access into the interior province of Coahuila, Nuevo Leon, and Tamaulipas was closed off to them. Yet the struggle for independence opened the floodgates. Quote, we observe that the indigenous people, who during entire centuries had taken just a handful of children as captives. I don't like this dude's doing. Ramos recounted in the short years between 1860 and 1821 took more than 2,000 captives of all kinds, gender, ages, and killed as many people or more in the Coahuila, Nuevo Leon, and the Tamaulipas. He was personally affected by the upsurge of Comanche activity. Ramos owned 800 square leagues, more than 4 million acres. No wonder they wanted to fuck him up. As well of well-irrigated land on the Rio Grande. But he could neither protect nor develop his vast domain, because it laid in the path of Comanche expansion. His property included the ruins of the old presidios of Agua Verde, a poignant reminder of Mexico military retreat. The Comanche would go on to wage ruinous wars in northern Mexico in 1830s and 1840s, as historian Brian DeLay has shown. Well, of course they would, because they want their fucking shit back. Duh. Oh, I can't say that, sorry. They mounted more than 40 raids into Mexico during this period, more than 2 per year on average. Half of them were actually large-scale military operations involving up to 1,000 warriors, considering that total Comanche population may have been between 10 to 12,000, and assume that there was 1 warrior for every 5 Comanche. A, quote, raid of 1,000 men amounted to half the Comanche fighting forces, as DeLay notes. Just as impressive was their geographic scope. They came to engulf much of Chihuahua, Durango, Coahuila, and Nuevo Leon, as well as half of the Tamaulipas, reaching as far south as Zacatecas, San Luis Potosi, and Querétaro, not far from Mexico City. These raiding campaigns were not intended solely for even primarily to take captives. Later interviews of Comanches make clear that the acquisition of horses was the principal objective. Warriors competed with one another over the number of mounts they possessed and sought to procure as many horses as they could by any means. Chief Asakip expressed great pride in his 4 sons because they could steal more horses than any other young men in the tribe. In fact, Horses were an absolute necessity for any long-distance raids. To conduct this campaign, Comanches needed to travel hundreds of miles, and once deep in Mexico, they needed to retreat swiftly, carrying captives and loot. Having sufficient animals and the ability to change the fresh mounts was crucial. Procuring goods was another major goal, and these incursions, the Comancherías was a trading center that absorbed a variety of commodities that were consumed internally or traded to other groups. Clothes and textiles were excellent forms of plunder, lightweight, easy to transport, and always in high demand. Raiders went through a trouble of removing the clothes of their prisoners before unaliving them and taking shirts and pants from corpse during a raid. They also paid special attention to metal objects. Knives, lances, and firearms were obviously important, but Comanche raiders also took latches, nails, bolts, and other metal objects that could be transformed into viable tools with a forage. Even though taking captives was not the primary purpose of these raids, Comanches took hundreds of them, and in 1830s, 1850s, each would fetch anywhere between 50 and as much as 1,000 pesos or dollars. For in a golden era, there was plenty, but parity between the two currencies. In other words, in the middle of the 19th century, a captive was far more valuable than a horse or a mare. A group of Apaches traveled near the Pancos River in February 1850, for example, exchanging 10-year-old boys from Saltillo for one mare, one rifle, one pair of drawers, 30 small packages of powder, some bullets, and one buffalo robe. End quote. Around the same time, a 12-year-old boy from Mexico was traded east of the Rio Grande, somewhere in New Mexico, for corn and tobacco. One knife, one shirt, one mule, one small package of powder, and a few balls. The Comanche and Apache must have developed a good sense of value and desirability of each type of captive, which varied greatly depending on the circumstances. Anglo-Americans and well-off Hispanic people of Mexico origin living in somewhat is now the American Southwest were especially attractive because they could be held for ransom. Women were more valuable than men. Youngsters, but not babies, were preferred over older folk. Boys were preferred over girls, and adult males were generally not worth the trouble except in unusual circumstances. They were just trying to fucking get their shit back. Jesus Christ. What's up, Wilby? Any Comanche man could propose a raid, spread the word that the war party was about to leave, and invite all others to join in, proving leaders had an easier time gaining a following. Less experienced or poorer male typically fielded smaller parties. A council was often held to approve the raids, which necessarily would have political consequences, and to work out the details: where to go, what route to follow, how many warriors, horses, and weapons to take. These parties could target American caravans or particular communities. During the 1830s and 1870s, most of the raids were directed against Mexican, Coahuila, Nuevo León, Durango, Zacatecas, and some other Mexican states were far enough from the Comancheria and possessed enough animals, textiles, tools, and potential captives to make them attractive targets. According to the recollection of Comanche elders interviewed decades later, the day before departure, all members of the raiding party, decked out in their war costumes, paraded on horseback around the teepees so that everyone could see the strength and members of the group. Other men could join the party at this time, a dance in which only those going on the raid could participate, followed. The members of the raiding party also sang and invited young women to sing with them. This was a perpetuous time for marriage and proposals and elopements. Sorry. Once they were on the trail, the first order of the day was to acquire sufficient animals. Ideally, each warrior had to have a riding horse, a pack animal to carry his clothes, and other belongings. Additionally, each raiding party included a cook who was responsible for supplying supplies of the entire group. This person was selected for industry, activities, alertness, and willingness to do what was needed, and was often, interestingly, a Mexican captive. To carry all the water and food the group needed to cook required sufficient beasts of burden. Consequently, it was not unusual to raid parties to spend a lot of time getting the necessary animals. The warriors descended on barns and corrals, killing wranglers and stampeding or leading away the animals. When it came time to divide the spoils, the cook frequently got to choose the first because horses and mules were so necessary for his work. Comanche parties undertook long-distance journeys and reconnaissance, and discoveries that lasted weeks or even months, comparable to the Spanish expeditions of the 16th century, but in the other direction. After all, Chihuahua City was 270 miles away from the Comanchera, Durango 660 miles, and Zacatecas was nearly 800 miles. Just getting there was a considerable feat. The raiders sometimes traveled at night and slept during the day to avoid detection. Surviving the desert of North Mexico was no less challenging for Comanches than it was for other parched travelers. Because the terrain was unfamiliar, party members had to rely on intelligence culled from the variety of sources. Indigenous allies, trading partners, captives, and other assortments of unwilling formants. Then, when the attackers at last neared their target, they hid in the woods or another protected area. They rested before striking, and detested from lighting a fire. Each man selected his best horse and prepared for the raid. A cook and some sentries usually stayed behind with supplies and any captives they already had in their possession. Everyone had precise instructions about when and where to ravenous and made contingency plans. Witnesses emphasizes the stealth of these indigenous attackers, which in an instant, I'm going to call them rebels. I'm going to call them fighters, free resistance fighters. They're resistance fighters, which is in an instant could turn a placid night into a surreal scene of mayhem, complete with screams and las barbaras. I don't know if I'm allowed to say that. Gunshots, galloping horses, and flying arrows. Outlaying ranches, isolating horses, and shepherds plying their trade in remote areas were easy pickings. But Comanche warriors sometimes targeted large Mexican towns as well. In December 1840 and January 1841, a group of indigenous attackers spent 2 weeks. These are resistance fighters. 2 week raids ranches in the vicinity of Saltillo, a capital of the state of Coahuila. I don't want to say. Moving from one ranch to the next, as if in complete defiance of any Mexican retribution. In the feat of unconceivable audacity, as the Mexican press labeled it, they appeared right on the outskirt of the city before being driven away by a hastily assembled Mexican force. Similar to August 1846, during one of the most daring and brazen raids of all, some 500 Comanche cut a swath through Chihuahua and Durango. George F. Ruxton, an Englishman who was traveling through northern Mexico at the time, left us a bleak portrayal, abandoning ranches, impassable roads, and barricaded towns, living in dread of indigenous raids. When he reached the city of Durango in September, he was astonished to learn that the talk of this town, of some 18,000 inhabitants, was not about the ongoing U.S.-Mexican War, but about the possible indigenous invasion by Comanches who had been ravaging haciendas to the northwest of the city. They should do this. I'm sorry, but I'm with the indigenous people on this completely. Along with horses and trade goods, Comanches made away with captives. The testimony of the Abelinio Fontes is fairly typical. He was walking with 3 brothers and 1 sister along the path in the vicinity of the Manclavo sometime in 1838 when a group of 30 warriors descended on them. The attackers immediately killed the oldest brother, Pedro, but to put the other children on horses and began retreating. Abelinio was 7 years old at the time. The following day, a Mexican force caught up with the Comanches, forcing them to shed all of their captives except Abelino. The raiders then continued to travel north. Captives like Abelino sometimes tried to escape, while they were still close to their home communities in relative proximity to other Mexican towns. That is why indigenous people often bound captives with ropes before going to sleep, or even while riding. After crossing the Rio Grande, and especially after having reached the Chira, such precautions became unnecessary. Lacking horses, weapons, and provisions, it was extremely risky for captives to set up on their own in the immense southern plains. By the 19th century, the market for captives along the U.S.-Mexico border was well developed with suppliers, buyers, and widely known intermediaries. Along most indigenous groups, they didn't take captives. Not all were involved in this to the same degree. Because their geographic location and strength, some bands of Comanches, Apaches, and other plain indigenous people did much of the actual Captain Fernando Gonzalo singled out the Yamparicas, a band of Comanches, or the Kiowas, a group of closely allied with the Comanches, some Apache bands, the Lampens, the Mescaleros, the Gelonons, the Segregatacs, or the, oh my gosh, I'm sorry, I'm messing these all up, the Saretacas, and generic term for plains indigenous use by the Comanches as the principal captive takers in northern Mexico. I don't like how this guy's doing this. These bands often traded their prisoners away. Now that's okay, prisoners, because they are prisoners, because these indigenous people are trying to take back their land. Where they also retained many captives who were incorporated into their respective bands and came to compromise significant proportions of their overall population. According to American ethnographer James Mooney, American ethnographer, not an indigenous person, who spent 5 years doing field work among the Kiowa indigenous people in the 1890s, quote, at least 1/4 of the whole number have more or less, okay, not doing that. Chiefly Mexicans and Mexican indigenous people, with indigenous of other tribes, and several white people taken from Texas when children. I see, that's cool. Since the Comanche families conducted in Oklahoma Territory in 1902, fully 45% turned out to be a Mexican descent. If the principal suppliers of captives are few and easy to identify, the customers are somewhat more scattered. New Mexican families in the market for servants, the plain indigenous people themselves, and the Anglo-American merchants had fort operators on the frontier. Yeah, you're right. The Bent brothers, William Charles, are an excellent case in point. They started trading with the indigenous peoples of Dakota in the early 1820s before moving their operations to Upper Arkansas River in what is now southeastern Colorado. Where they built and imposed square structures out of adobe brick. In 1829, I'm going to try to finish this page. In 1828 and 1829, their sense of geography and timing could not have been better. Right along the U.S.-Mexico border, on the edge of the Comancheria, and a necessary stopover point for the caravan travels between Missouri and New Mexico. In its heyday, in 1830s and 1840s, Bent's Fort employed more than 100 individuals, including merchants, teamsters, hunters, herders, and laborers. Many of these employees were Mexicans whom Colonel William Bent had purchased from people. I know for several instances of this kind, and there must have been many others, recalled George Bent Williams, half white, half Cheyenne son. Oof. Quote, one peon who was bought by my father from the, in earlier days, now living down here in the Kiowa agency. Another captive my father bought was a German who was carried off by the Kiowas from a German colony in Texas so they're talking about white people being sold by the okay. All right. When he was a small boy, Comanches and Kiowa regularly headed the Bent Fort to trade horses and other plunder, including captives. From these visits, George Bent was able to ascertain that among the Kiowas and Comanches, nearly every family had one or more white captives. The women captives married into the tribe. The boys and men were employed by the indigenous as herders to guard the horses when out grazing. But after the men had lived with the indigenous people a number of years, they became regular warriors, and more intelligent and brave ones led warrior parties of indigenous people on raids into Mexico and Texas. From published to unpublished sources, Reveria Martinez has identified 470 captives taken by the Comanche from 1820s to 1860s. It is impossible to know how many cases went unrecorded. From the sample, however, it is clear that most of the victims were basically from Spain. 75%, falling behind other Anglo-Americans 10%. They were taking white people as captives. Hell yeah. All right. We'll stop here. Page 202 at the beginning. They're taking so we stopped on 202. All right, Joe, what's up?
So, let's see. Learning about the friars and all that they did to help push forward enslavement was a lot more than I knew. I didn't know that they were involved in the slavery.
Mm-hmm. Yep. And you know what? Valid that the indigenous people decided to take white people like Spaniards and Englishmen and German people. Valid.
Yes,
They're like, you know what?
Yep, I agree. That's really good.
Yeah, and the ravaging diseases that happen because colonialists from Europe coming in and causing all the diseases. Can you imagine, like, living in a community or a region where there's no diseases of these types at all, and then like boom, white people come in there and it ravages people. That's another tool of germ warfare that they utilize on the indigenous people. You know?
Yes.
Yeah. But anyways, all right. Does anybody have anything else to say? You have anything else to say?
No, I'm good.
All right. Anybody else have anything to say at all? All right. Seems like we're good. All right. Let's see how far we got. What's next? 202. Remember 202. Well, actually, no. 202. We're about halfway done. I gotta get back to my 202. 202. About halfway done. So everybody, there we go, on 202. Perfect. All right. Okay, well, since no one else has anything, I'll go ahead and close it out, and I'll hope you all have a good evening. I don't know if Two Spirit and them are going to go live yet. I don't know. All right.